Sand. Unrelenting, eternal sand. It grinds into your collar, abrades your corneas, and slowly devours the last shred of hope remaining in the Afrika corpse. It is November 12, 1942. We are deep in the North African waste, somewhere on the blurred border between Tunisia and Libya right now. The air here hangs heavy, thick with a unique, nauseating perfume, a mixture of burned rubber, scorched metal, and stale motor oil that permeates everything. To Hans, a scout for the 10th Panzer Division, this smell is simply the scent of death. Just hours ago, this patch of desert witnessed a brutal slaughter. A flight of British Royal Air Force Hurricanes had swept down like vultures from the low sky, their 20mm cannons tearing the air apart. They turned a small, unsuspecting German transport convoy into twisted sculptures of burning scrap metal. Hans had lain flat behind a scorching sand dune. He listened to the dull, concussive thumps of truck fuel tanks exploding behind him, listening to the sounds of his comrades screaming in the fire. When the drone of the aircraft engines finally faded and the desert returned to its two-minus-like silence, broken only by the popping sound of cooling metal. Hans dusted the grit from his uniform. He walked toward the wreckage of the mixed British and American column they had been engaging amidst the carnage. It was not a normal vehicle. Surrounded by trucks that had been flipped by impacts, their axles snapped and cabs crushed, this small machine sat quietly. Its windshield was shattered and a piece of shrapnel had sliced a chunk of rubber off the left front tire, but other than that, it looked disturbingly whole. It seemed as if it had just rolled off a Detroit assembly line and been teleported into this Hell's Cape, even though Hans was only a humble corporal. But before the war, he had spent 3 years as an apprentice at the Daimler factory in Stuttgart, driven by his deep professional instinct. He did not scavenge the dead for cigarettes or beef tins like the others, but instead walked straight to the machine and reached inside. He tried to turn the key stuck in the ignition slot, and there was no hesitation, no need for a warm-up. With a violent boom, the engine roared to life, and it did not purr with the precision of a German Maybach engine, nor did it wheeze like an overworked Opel. It sounded like a beast that had been kicked awake rough wild, but exploding with vitality, causing Hans to freeze after the hellish retreat. From El Alamein, where every German vehicle seemed to be dying of thirst, overheating, or waiting for parts that would never come. This abandoned American car roared simply because he turned the key, even though standard orders were to destroy any enemy material that could not be carried. But this time, the small car, the Jeep, was hitched to the back of a surviving half-track and dragged back. At that moment, no one realized that this small trophy was about to deliver a psychological blow to the Afrika corpse more devastating than 1,000 bombs. This would not be a simple mechanical inspection. It would be a public execution of the German philosophy of war breaking their industrial faith. To understand the weight of this moment, we must wind the clock back slightly to the nights that haunted every German soldier, the climax of El Alamein. That was true Helmut Gum. Ries artillery painted thousands of arcs of death across the night sky, the ground trembling as if the earth itself were shivering. In that battle, German tank crews faced a new suffocating despair. Imagine sitting inside an obsolete Panzer III or a powerful but retreating Panzer IV. Your vision limited to the narrow slit of a periscope, you smell the sweat, the urine, the cordotin, you hear the screech of tracks grinding on stone. And then you see them, not one, not 10, but a tide of Sherman tanks. You destroy one and to take its place immediately, relentlessly. You destroy two and 5 more crest the horizon. In that moment, the thought flashed through every German anchor's mind, saying this is impossible. Where are they getting this much steel? Where are they finding these crews? The despair came not just from tactical inferiority, but something deeper. But from the visceral realization that they were fighting a monster they could not comprehend, and now a microcosm of that monster was sitting under the bulb. The workshop master mechanic, an old Oberfeld Web L, named Klaus, circled the Jeep 3 times, holding a precision caliper. In his hand he held the symbol of the German industrial spirit, while his eyes sharp as a hawk's in every detail. The young mechanics around him held their breath waiting for the verdict, while behind them the low rumble of bombing runs served as a constant reminder that the war was getting closer. "Open the hood, Klaus," said his voice, gravelly and low. Two young soldiers undid the spring latches on the sides of the hood. Note that simple spring latches, not precision knobs. The hood was lifted, exposing the heart of the beast, the Willys MB engine, which, if this were a beauty contest, would lose. The casting surface was atrocious. You could see the granular texture left by the sand molds, and the edges had flash. The paint was applied carelessly, with drips frozen in place to a German technician raised on Porsche artistic perfection. This was industrial garbage. "Look at this," Klaus pointed to the intake manifold. "The tolerances are massive and loose. If an apprentice at the Benz factory made a part like this, he would be fired on the spot." The young mechanics laughed. Yes, this was American junk, crude, ugly, and with no soul. They felt a sliver of comfort, thinking, "We may have lost the battle, but at least we are superior." The illusion of superiority had kept them going in North Africa for 2 years, but as the désestimably went deeper, the laughter died, replaced by silence. It was replaced by a deathly silence and the sound of breathing becoming heavy. Klaus moved to the chassis, finding the car had no complex suspension. It simply used for thick, ugly steel leaves, springs that looked like iron bars, and in the eyes of a German engineer, this was archaic and backward. It would make the ride quality feel like falling down a flight of stairs, but then a memory struck Klaus, reminding him of an incident just days prior. A German Kubelwagen, the pride of the Wehrmacht, with its sophisticated torsion bar suspension, had hit a rock during the chaotic retreat. The complex suspension arm snapped and the vehicle was paralyzed instantly, so the 4 soldiers inside had to abandon a knitted run on foot, only to be hunted down like rabbits by British Spitfires in the open desert. But looking at this crude leaf spring in front of him, Klaus took a wrench. He struck it hard and it rang with a dull metallic thud, meaning even if it snapped in half, this car would still drive, or a blacksmith could fix it back into shape in 10 minutes. "So it does not need to be precise," Klaus muttered to himself as beads of sweat formed on his forehead. "It only needs to be alive." The true horror arrived when they removed the transfer case, which was a brutally simple mechanical structure. A thick, clumsy lever allowed the driver to instantly distribute power to all 4 wheels with no complex electronic locking mechanisms. No fluid couplings, just gear-on-gear violence. A wounded soldier, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had wandered into the tent, leaned in. He looked at the 4-wheel doctor system and his eyes held a look of greedy envy. In Russia, the wounded man's voice trembled with fear. "In the Russian mud, our Kubelwagens only have rear-wheel drive. When the autumn rains turn the roads into swamps, it takes 10 men to push 1 car. What good is a Maybach engine if the wheels do not turn? It becomes scrap metal waiting to be abandoned in the cold." And while we were pushing our cars, the Soviet T-34s would burst out of the tree line. He did not finish, but everyone understood. The Volkswagen Type 80 to Kubelwagen was furred in Porsche's masterpiece, light, weight, cooled, precise, but in extreme environments. It was a prima donna, it was fragile, but this Jeep, it did not care about mud, it did not care about grit, horse, and getting in the gears. It did not care if the driver was a farm boy from Texas who had never touched a steering wheel before. Its design language spoke only one sentence: advance, advance at all costs. The dissection continued. Every part removed and placed on the oil-stained canvas table seemed to scream a silent mockery at the German industrial system. Look at the generator, the mounting holes, worst standardized, meaning it could fit in a tractor or a truck. Look at the carburetor, the structure was so simple it was insulting. Ifs and got in, you could strip it, blow it out and reassemble in 5 minutes. But what drove Klaus to despair were the bolts, not the 7 or 8 different specifications of specialty screws required for a German truck, but common, ubiquitous, standardized bolts. This meant that if a part broke on the battlefield, you could salvage a bolt from a destroyed truck or even a tractor and it would fit interchangeably. Klaus spat the word out like it was poison. In the Wehrmacht, every tank, every truck was almost a unique individual Tiger tank. Parts did not fit Panther tanks, even within the same model. Parts from different production batches often required hand filing to fit. This was why, on the retreat roads, you saw so many magnificent beasts. German steel beasts abandoned simply because they lacked a single specific washer or connecting rod. They were beautiful tombs. The Americans, they had turned war into a math problem, and they had solved it with an assembly line just as the mechanics stood staring. At the pile of parts, the ground shook violently from another Allied air raid. Through the shattered windows, the horizon toward the harbor glowed red. The supply port at Tunis, the last hope for evacuation back to Europe, was being pounded by thousands of tons of high explosives right now. An infantry captain fresh from the front lines stumbled into the workshop covered in blood and dust, clutching an MP-40 submachine gun tightly. He was hunting for vehicles. "We need transport," the captain roared, his voice cracking. "The British Shermans have broken the line 5 kilometers out. My men are still behind us. They do not have the legs to outrun tank treads," he shouted. Then his wild eyes landed on the half-disassembled Jeep. A flash of frantic hope lit his eyes, instantly extinguished when he saw the parts scattered on the floor. Damn it, why is even the captured loot broken? Klaus looked at the captain and then did something shocking, offering no explanation. He simply turned to his mechanics and screamed, "Put it back together now." What followed was another display of the miraculous. If they were reassembling a German half-track motorcycle, this team would need half a day for calibration. But this Jeep, the massive bolt hole seemed to guide the screws into place automatically with no complex timing adjustments or precision hydraulic connections. In 20 minutes, the completely dismembered Jeep stood whole again, and Klaus jumped into the driver's seat. He did not even bother to use the key. He found the ignition system so simple he could hot wire it in seconds. Once again, that crude boom echoed through the workshop. The infantry captain was stunned. He vaulted into the passenger seat, grabbing the mount where a heavy Browning used to be. The Jeep roared out, charging into the swirlings and carrying the last survival instincts of the desperate German soldiers. It was a picture of supreme irony. Days later, the technical analysis report on the Jeep was sent to Berlin, authored by Klaus. He used no flowery language and did not try to please his superiors. Instead, he wrote with a cold and clinical finality. "This is a vehicle without a soul. It has no aesthetic value. The craftsmanship is rude and the tolerances are loose and sloppy. However, it is perfectly designed for the singular purpose of war, and every single part screams mass production and efficiency." The Americans did not build this car to last for generations. They built it to be spent like a bullet and replaced easily. In this field, we are an entire era behind. The report was buried in a mountain of paperwork in Berlin, ignored by the command. Hitler was still fantasizing about wonder weapons that would turn the tide, like the V-2 rockets or the new jet fighters. He did not understand that winning a war does not depend on building one artifact of the gods. It depends on building 1 million machines. Let us pull the camera back, way back, high enough to overlook the entire Mediterranean in 1943. On that blue expanse, Allied Liberty ship convoys formed moving cities, and in the belly of every single ship they were stuffed with Jeeps. While a German Panzer division remained immobilized, waiting for 3 precision Maybach engines to be hand-finished. The Ford Willow Run plant was completing a B-20 for Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Willys and Ford factories were rolling a new Jeep off the line every 2 minutes. If you were a German soldier captured that year, you would be transported to a POW camp in the United States. The journey would shatter your worldview. You would see the docks at Norfolk where cranes grabbed brand new Jeeps like toys. You would watch them drop one dent fender and simply push it aside to grab another one. You would see American G is driving Jeeps at breakneck speeds, crashing them into ditches, laughing, and simply hopping into a fresh one. To a German raised to cherish every bar of soap and every screw, this waste was criminal. But then came the sinking feeling only a nation with infinite resources could afford to be this criminal. The final phase of the war was like a duel between a master fencer and a giant with a sledgehammer. The fencer's technique was flawless, every thrust hit a vital spot, but the giant did not care. The giant just kept swinging the hammer once, twice, 3 times, and the fencer would tire. The sword would snap, but the giant's supply of hammers was endless, and the Jeep was that hammer. Back in the North African night of 1940, to old Klaus sat alone in the empty workshop, holding a spare bolt. It was a standard 3/8-inch Bolton. Looking at it, he seemed to see the burning future of Berlin. He pulled a cheap cigarette lit, it inhaled deeply, and spoke to the empty room. "We build works of art, they build war." Behind him, the radio crackled with a speech by Goebbels calling for total war. Klaus smiled bitterly. Total war. Looking at that standardized bolt, he knew Germany had lost the moment. The first standardized nut was tightened. The sand continued to blow, burying the trenches and the arrogance of the Third Reich, leaving only the roar of the Jeep. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history, its deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield.